Captain Marcus Riley adjusted his worn leather jacket against the October chill as he stepped out of his pickup truck onto the cracked asphalt of Millbrook High School's abandoned parking lot. At 67, the silver-haired veteran moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had spent decades navigating dangerous terrain, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to uncover beneath the overgrown football field of his old alma mater. The class of 1994 had vanished without a trace during their senior trip to the remote Pine Ridge Mountains 31 years ago, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and heartbroken families. What Marcus didn't know as he approached the condemned school building was that a routine demolition project was about to expose a truth so disturbing that it would shatter everything the small town of Cedar Falls thought it knew about that fateful graduation weekend. And the man they had trusted to protect their children would finally face the consequences of his unspeakable actions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty schoolyard as Marcus walked toward the chain-link fence that surrounded the property. Millbrook High School had been closed for 15 years, its brick facade now crumbling and covered in graffiti, windows boarded up with plywood that bore the scars of countless teenage adventures. The sight filled Marcus with a complex mixture of nostalgia and unease. This place had been the cornerstone of his youth, where he had played football, met his first girlfriend, and made the lifelong friendships that had sustained him through 2 tours in Vietnam and a 30-year career in law enforcement. Marcus had graduated in 1975, nearly 2 decades before the class that would become Cedar Falls' most enduring mystery. But the disappearance of those 23 students and their 2 chaperones had haunted the entire community, casting a shadow over every subsequent graduation ceremony and leaving a wound that never fully healed. As the former sheriff of Cedar County, Marcus had spent countless hours poring over the case files, following leads that inevitably led nowhere, and comforting families who continued to hope for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. The official investigation had concluded that the students' bus had gone off a mountain road during a severe storm, plunging into the Pine Ridge Gorge, where the wreckage was presumably swept away by the rushing waters below. Search teams had scoured the area for months, finding only scattered pieces of luggage and personal belongings that had washed up miles downstream. The case was eventually classified as a tragic accident, though it remained technically open due to the lack of recoverable remains, but Marcus had never been entirely satisfied with that explanation. There were too many inconsistencies, too many questions that the official narrative failed to address. Why had the bus deviated from its planned route? Why were there no witnesses to the alleged accident, despite the road being a popular trucking corridor? Most troubling of all, why had the students' cell phones stopped transmitting signals simultaneously at 11:47 p.m. on May 15, 1994, more than an hour before they were supposed to have reached the mountain pass, where the accident allegedly occurred? These questions had gnawed at Marcus throughout his career, surfacing whenever he encountered other cases that didn't quite add up. He had developed a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession, never closing a case until every loose thread had been examined and re-examined. It was a trait that had served him well in law enforcement, but had also cost him relationships and sleepless nights as he wrestled with the cases that remained unsolved. The demolition of Millbrook High School had been scheduled to begin 3 weeks ago, but environmental concerns had delayed the project while crews tested for asbestos and other hazardous materials. Marcus had been following the demolition plans closely, not out of any particular attachment to the building itself, but because he had noticed something in the architectural surveys that had caught his attention. The basement level of the school extended much further than he had realized, with a network of utility tunnels and storage areas that had been sealed off decades ago when the building's heating system was modernized. It was a small detail, the kind that most people would overlook, but Marcus had learned to pay attention to spaces that were forgotten or deliberately hidden. In his experience, secrets had a way of gravitating toward the places where nobody thought to look. The missing. Class had spent their final day at Millbrook High School attending graduation practice and picking up their caps and gowns. They had been excited, full of plans for college and careers, ready to embark on the adventure that was supposed to mark their transition from childhood to adulthood. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through the contact list until he found the number for Janet Morrison, the site supervisor for the demolition project. They had spoken several times over the past month as Marcus tried to arrange a final walkthrough of the building before it was torn down. Janet had been accommodating, understanding that the former sheriff had sentimental reasons for wanting to see the place one last time. The phone rang twice before Janet answered, her voice crackling slightly through the poor cell reception in the area. "Marcus, good morning. Are you at the site already?" "Just arrived," Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot where graduation ceremonies had been held for decades. "Is your crew ready for me to take a look around?" "Actually, we've had a bit of a development," Janet said, and Marcus could hear the tension in her voice. The environmental team found something unusual when they were testing the basement areas. "Yesterday, we've had to call in some additional specialists." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of something unusual?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could hear muffled voices in the background. "I think it would be better if you came down here and saw it for yourself. We're in the basement level, accessible through the old maintenance. Entrance on the east side of the building. Bring a flashlight if you have one." The call ended abruptly, leaving Marcus standing alone in the parking lot with a growing sense of unease. He had spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize the tone in Janet's voice. It was the same careful, controlled way people spoke when they had discovered something they wished they hadn't found. He retrieved a heavy-duty flashlight from his truck's glove compartment and made his way around the perimeter of the building to the maintenance entrance Janet had mentioned. The door was propped open with a concrete block, and Marcus could see the glow of work lights emanating from somewhere deep within the building's bowels. The air that drifted out carried the musty smell of decades-old dust and something else, a faint chemical odor that reminded him of the evidence rooms at the police station. He stepped through the doorway and found himself in a narrow corridor, lined with pipes and electrical conduits, the ceiling so low that he had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head. Following the sound of voices and the glow of the work lights, Marcus made his way deeper into the basement. The corridor branched off in several directions, creating a maze-like network of passages that he had never known existed during his high school years. The walls were concrete block, painted institutional green decades ago, but now stained with rust and water damage. His footsteps echoed in the confined space, creating an unsettling rhythm that seemed to amplify the isolation of being so far underground. As he rounded a corner, Marcus found himself in a larger chamber where Janet Morrison and two other people were standing around what appeared to be a hole in the floor. The work lights they had set up cast harsh shadows on their faces, giving them an almost ghostly appearance in the underground space. Janet looked up as Marcus approached, and he could see the worry etched in the lines around her eyes. "Marcus, thanks for coming down," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the concrete chamber. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen from the environmental consulting firm and Detective Ray Thompson from the County Sheriff's Department." Marcus nodded to both of them, but his attention was immediately drawn to the hole in the floor. It appeared to have been carefully excavated, with precise edges that suggested it had been dug deliberately rather than created by natural decay or accident. The opening was roughly rectangular, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and from what he could see in the beam of his flashlight, it extended down at least 10 feet into the earth below. "What exactly are we looking at here?" Marcus asked, though something in his gut already knew that whatever they had found was connected to the question that had haunted him for 3 decades. Dr. Chen stepped forward, consulting a tablet computer that displayed what appeared to be ground-penetrating radar images. "We were conducting routine soil testing when our equipment detected some unusual density variations in this area. When we started digging to investigate, we found this cavity. But that's not the unusual part." She paused, exchanging a meaningful glance with Detective Thompson. "The unusual part is what's inside the cavity. We've found what appear to be personal belongings, clothing, jewelry, identification cards, all dating from the mid-1990s. 23 sets of belongings, to be exact." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of Dr. Chen's words sank in. 23 sets of belongings. The exact number of students who had vanished on their graduation trip 31 years ago. He stepped closer to the edge of the excavation, his flashlight beam probing the depths of the cavity. There, partially visible in the disturbed earth, he could make out fragments of what appeared to be a class ring, its surface tarnished but still bearing the distinctive design of Millbrook High School's 1994 graduating class. The silence in the underground chamber was broken only by the hum of the work lights and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Marcus found himself transported back to May 1994, remembering the frantic phone calls from parents when the bus failed to arrive at its destination, the massive search effort that had mobilized hundreds of volunteers, and the gradual realization that an entire graduating class had simply vanished into thin air. "Has anyone else seen this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Detective Thompson shook his head. "We called you as soon as we realized what we were dealing with. Given your history with the case, we thought you should be involved from the beginning." Marcus nodded, his mind already racing through the implications of this discovery. If the personal belongings of the missing students were buried here beneath their own high school, then everything about the official investigation had been wrong. The students had never made it to the mountains. They had never left Cedar Falls at all. Someone had deliberately concealed their fate, creating an elaborate deception that had fooled law enforcement, families, and the entire community for over 3 decades. As he stared down into the excavated cavity, Marcus realized that this was just the beginning. The discovery of the students' belongings would inevitably lead to more questions, and those questions would eventually lead to answers that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep hidden. After 31 years of wondering what had happened to the class of 1994, Cedar Falls was about to learn the truth, and Marcus suspected that the truth would be far more disturbing than anyone had ever imagined. The town of Cedar Falls had always prided itself on being the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, and children could ride their bicycles safely through tree-lined streets until well after dark. Nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania, the community of 8,000 residents had weathered the decline of the local steel industry by reinventing itself as a haven for retirees and young families seeking an escape from urban chaos. Main Street still boasted a functioning hardware store, a family-owned diner that served breakfast all day, and a barbershop where conversations about high school football could stretch for hours. But beneath this carefully maintained facade of small-town tranquility, Cedar Falls harbored secrets that ran as deep as the limestone caves that honeycombed the hills surrounding the valley. The disappearance of the class of 1994 had created invisible fault lines throughout the community, dividing families and friendships along lines of suspicion and grief that had never fully healed. Some residents had moved away in the years following the tragedy, unable to bear the constant reminders of loss that seemed to lurk around every corner. Others had stayed but changed, their easy trust in neighbors and institutions replaced by a wariness that manifested in locked doors and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when outsiders approached. The official narrative of what had happened to those 23 students and their 2 chaperones had become a kind of sacred text in Cedar Falls, repeated so often and with such conviction that questioning it seemed almost blasphemous. The bus carrying the graduating seniors had left Millbrook High School at 6:30 p.m. on May 15, 1994, bound for a weekend retreat at Camp Wildwood in the Pine Ridge Mountains. The students were excited about their final adventure together before scattering to colleges and jobs across the country. Many had been friends since elementary school, their bonds forged through years of shared classes, sports teams, and school dances. According to the official account, severe weather had moved into the Pine Ridge region unexpectedly that evening, bringing heavy rain and dangerous wind conditions. The bus driver, an experienced local man named Robert Kellerman, who'd been transporting school groups for over 20 years, had radioed the school district at 9:15 p.m. to report that he was taking a more sheltered route through the mountains to avoid the worst of the storm. That was the last communication anyone had received from the bus. When the students failed to arrive at Camp Wildwood by the expected time of 11:00 p.m., the camp director had initially assumed they were simply running late due to the weather. It wasn't until the following morning, when repeated attempts to contact the bus by radio went unanswered, that search efforts began in earnest. State police helicopters had combed the mountainous terrain for days, while ground teams explored every accessible road and trail in the Pine Ridge wilderness. The search had been complicated by a secondary storm system that had moved through the area on May 17th, bringing flash floods that had turned normally placid streams into raging torrents. Searchers had found scattered debris along the banks of Pine Creek, including pieces of luggage that families had identified as belonging to their children. A backpack belonging to Jennifer Walsh, the class valedictorian, had been discovered, lodged in a logjam 15 miles downstream from the presumed accident site. Sarah Henderson's track jacket had been found wrapped around a boulder in the creek bed, its fabric torn and stained with mud. These discoveries had provided enough evidence to convince investigators that the bus had indeed gone off the road and into the gorge, where the rushing waters had swept away both the vehicle and its occupants. The official conclusion was that the bus had been completely destroyed by the impact and subsequent flooding, with the remains scattered across miles of rugged wilderness. The case file noted that similar accidents in the region had resulted in vehicles being buried under tons of debris and sediment, making recovery virtually impossible. But the families of the missing students had never fully accepted this explanation, forming an informal support group that met monthly to share information and keep pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. Margaret Walsh, Jennifer's mother, had become an unofficial spokesperson for the group, maintaining a detailed timeline of the events and inconsistencies that she believed had been overlooked by the official investigation. She had collected weather reports from the night of the disappearance, interviewed truckers who had traveled the mountain roads, and even hired a private investigator to examine the scene of the alleged accident. The most troubling discrepancy in Margaret's research concerned the timing of the students' final communications with their families. Several of the students had called home using their cell phones between 7 and 8 p.m. on May 15th, reporting that they were making good time and looking forward to the weekend at camp. These calls had all originated from cell towers in the Cedar Falls area, suggesting that the bus was still relatively close to town, at a time when it should have been well into the mountains. The phone records showed that all of the students' devices had gone silent simultaneously at 11:47 p.m., creating a digital dead zone that had never been adequately explained. Margaret had also discovered that the weather reports for the Pine Ridge Region on May 15, 1994, showed only light rain and mild winds, contradicting the official narrative of a severe storm that had forced the bus to take an alternate route. The flash flooding that had occurred 2 days later was attributed to a completely separate weather system, raising questions about how the students' belongings had ended up in the floodwaters if the original accident had occurred before the flooding began. These inconsistencies had led Margaret and other family members to develop their own theories about what had really happened that night. Some believed that the bus had been involved in an accident much closer to Cedar Falls, possibly on one of the winding country roads that connected the town to the interstate highway. Others suspected that mechanical problems or driver error had caused a tragedy that was subsequently covered up to protect the school district from liability. A few even wondered if the students had somehow been the victims of foul play, though they couldn't imagine who would want to harm a group of teenagers or why. The impact of the disappearance on Cedar Falls had extended far beyond the families directly affected. Millbrook High School had struggled for years with declining enrollment, as parents opted to send their children to neighboring districts rather than risk another tragedy. The school's athletic programs, once a source of community pride, had been decimated by the loss of talented seniors who would have served as mentors and leaders for younger students. Graduation ceremonies had become somber affairs, with empty chairs serving as reminders of the class that never got to walk across the stage. Local businesses had also felt the effects of the tragedy, as the constant media attention and association with the mysterious disappearance had made Cedar Falls a less attractive destination for tourists and new residents. The Pine Ridge Mountains, once a popular recreational area for hiking and camping, had seen visitor numbers plummet as people associated the region with danger and tragedy. Camp Wildwood, the intended destination for the missing students, had closed permanently 3 years after the disappearance, unable to overcome the negative publicity and declining bookings. The passage of time had done little to heal these wounds. Every May 15th brought renewed media attention to the case, with reporters returning to Cedar Falls to interview family members and produce anniversary stories that inevitably concluded with the same frustrating lack of resolution. The missing students had become frozen in time at 18 years old, their graduation photos displayed in shop windows and their names engraved on a memorial plaque in the town square. Their classmates, who had graduated early or been absent from the trip, had gone on to live their lives, but they carried the weight of survivors' guilt and the constant reminder that their friends had simply vanished into the night. The town's power structure had also been affected by the tragedy in ways that were subtle but significant. Robert Hendricks, who had been the school district superintendent at the time of the disappearance, had retired early amid questions about the adequacy of safety protocols for student trips. Chief of Police Daniel Morrison had left Cedar Falls 6 months after the search was officially called off, citing personal reasons, but leaving many to wonder if the unsolved case had taken a toll on his career and reputation. Even Mayor Patricia Collins, who had served for 12 years, had chosen not to seek re-election in 1996, telling friends that she no longer had the heart for public service after failing to bring closure to the grieving families. The vacuum left by these departures had been filled by newcomers who lacked the deep community connections and institutional memory that might have kept the case alive in official circles. The new police chief, brought in from a larger city, had focused his resources on more immediate concerns, like drug trafficking and property crime. The school board had hired a superintendent from outside the district who was more concerned with test scores and budget management than with investigating past tragedies. Even the mayor's office had been won by a candidate who had moved to Cedar Falls only 5 years before the election, bringing fresh perspectives but lacking the emotional investment in seeking answers for the missing students. This gradual changing of the guard had allowed the mystery of the class of 1994 to fade from official priority, relegated to the status of a cold case that was referenced in annual reports but received no active investigation. The families continued to push for answers, but their voices had less influence with each passing year, as the community leadership became increasingly disconnected from the original tragedy. The missing students had become a part of Cedar Falls' history rather than its present, their story told to newcomers as a cautionary tale rather than an active investigation requiring resolution. Marcus Riley's connection to the missing class of 1994 ran deeper than his professional obligation as the former sheriff who had overseen the investigation. Standing in that underground chamber beneath Millbrook High School, surrounded by the evidence that would shatter 3 decades of accepted truth, Marcus felt the weight of personal memories that had shaped his entire approach to law enforcement and justice. His own graduation from the same school in 1975 had been the launching pad for a life dedicated to protecting others, but it was the events of his childhood that had forged his unwavering commitment to uncovering truth, no matter how deeply buried or how painful the revelation might prove to be. Born in 1957 to a family that had called Cedar Falls home for 4 generations, Marcus had grown up in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, where his father worked as a foreman at the local steel mill, and his mother taught 3rd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary. The Riley family embodied the values that defined their community: hard work, personal responsibility, and an unshakable belief that doing the right thing would ultimately be rewarded. These principles had guided Marcus through his formative years, instilling in him a moral compass that would prove both a blessing and a burden throughout his career in law enforcement. The defining moment of Marcus's youth had occurred when he was 12 years old during the summer of 1969. His younger sister, Emma, only 8 at the time, had disappeared while walking home from her friend's house on a warm July evening. The family had spent 3 agonizing days searching the woods and fields around Cedar Falls, organizing volunteers and pleading with anyone who might have information about Emma's whereabouts. Marcus had barely slept during those 72 hours, haunted by visions of his sister lost and afraid, calling for help that never came. Emma had finally been found in the basement of an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles outside of town, physically unharmed but traumatized by her ordeal. Her captor was a drifter named Carl Preston, who had been living secretly in the vacant building for months, surviving by stealing food from local gardens and breaking into empty houses. Preston had taken Emma on impulse, claiming later that he had only wanted company and had never intended to hurt her. The local sheriff at the time, a political appointee more concerned with maintaining his image than conducting thorough investigations, had accepted Preston's story and allowed him to plead guilty to a reduced charge of unlawful restraint. But Marcus had overheard conversations between his parents that suggested the official version of events didn't tell the complete story. There had been other incidents involving Preston that had been quietly hushed up, other children who had reported encounters with a strange man near the old farmhouse. The sheriff had been eager to close the case quickly and avoid the kind of publicity that might reflect poorly on his department's ability to protect the community. Preston had served only 18 months in county jail before being released and drifting away to parts unknown. The experience of watching Emma struggle with nightmares and anxiety in the months following her rescue had planted a seed of anger in Marcus that grew stronger with each passing year. He became acutely aware of how adults in positions of authority could fail the children they were supposed to protect, either through incompetence, corruption, or simple unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The knowledge that Carl Preston might be out there somewhere, potentially threatening other children, had fueled Marcus's determination to pursue a career in law enforcement where he could ensure that such failures of justice would not go unchallenged. Marcus had enlisted in the army immediately after graduating from high school, serving 2 tours in Vietnam as a military police officer. The war had exposed him to levels of violence and moral complexity that had tested his faith in clear-cut notions of right and wrong, but it had also reinforced his belief that someone needed to stand guard against those who would prey on the innocent and vulnerable. He had returned to Cedar Falls in 1977 with a Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and a determination to make his home community safer than he had found it. Starting as a patrol officer with the Cedar County Sheriff's Department, Marcus had quickly earned a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. He was the deputy who would spend his own time and money following up on leads that other officers considered dead ends. He was the investigator who kept detailed files on every case, no matter how minor, believing that patterns and connections often became apparent only years after the original incidents. His superiors sometimes complained about his refusal to close cases that seemed hopeless, but his methods had resulted in solving several high-profile crimes that had stumped other detectives. The most significant of these had been the case of the Riverside Rapist, a serial offender who had terrorized women in 3 counties for over 2 years in the mid-1980s. While other jurisdictions had treated the attacks as isolated incidents, Marcus had recognized the pattern and spent months mapping the offender's movements and methodology. His persistence had ultimately led to the arrest and conviction of David Kowalski, a traveling salesman who had used his legitimate business trips to scout potential victims. The case had earned Marcus a promotion to detective sergeant and established his credibility as an investigator who could be trusted with the department's most challenging cases. When Sheriff Thomas Bradley announced his retirement in 1991, Marcus had been the unanimous choice of the county commissioners to succeed him. His campaign for the position had focused on modernizing investigative techniques and strengthening partnerships with state and federal law enforcement agencies. He had promised to bring scientific rigor to criminal investigations and to never close a case until every possible lead had been exhausted. The voters of Cedar County had responded by electing him with 73% of the vote, the largest margin in the county's history. Marcus had been sheriff for less than 3 years when the class of 1994 disappeared, but the case had immediately become the defining challenge of his career. From the moment the first frantic phone calls had come in, reporting that the bus had failed to arrive at Camp Wildwood, Marcus had thrown every available resource into the search effort. He had coordinated with state police helicopters, brought in tracking dogs from neighboring counties, and personally interviewed every student, teacher, and parent who might have relevant information about the planned trip. The initial phase of the investigation had consumed 18-hour days for nearly 2 months, as Marcus had followed every conceivable lead. He had examined the bus route in excruciating detail, timing the journey under various weather conditions and identifying every possible point where an accident might have occurred. He had interviewed the camp staff at Wildwood, the school administrators, who had approved the trip, and even the manufacturer of the bus to determine if mechanical failure might have played a role in the disappearance. But it was the inconsistencies in the evidence that had troubled Marcus most deeply. The weather reports that didn't match the official narrative of a severe storm, the cell phone records that showed the students had been near Cedar Falls hours after they should have reached the mountains, the scattered personal belongings that had been found in locations that didn't align with the presumed accident site. Each of these discrepancies had been explained away by other investigators as the inevitable confusion that surrounds any major incident But Marcus had catalogued them all in a private file that he had continued to review long after the case was officially closed. The decision to suspend active investigation of the disappearance had not been Marcus's choice. Pressure from state authorities, budget constraints, and the lack of new evidence had forced him to reassign detectives to other cases after the search had stretched into its fourth month. The families of the missing students had been understandably angry about the decision, and Margaret Walsh had been particularly vocal in her criticism of what she saw as the department's premature surrender. Marcus had tried to explain that the case would remain open and that any new evidence would be immediately investigated. But he knew that his words offered little comfort to parents who were still waiting for answers about their children's fate. Years following the official suspension of the investigation had been the most difficult of Marcus's career. He had continued to review the case files regularly, looking for patterns or connections that might have been missed in the initial investigation. He had maintained contact with law enforcement agencies across the region, asking them to be alert for any evidence that might be connected to the missing students. He had even consulted with retired FBI profilers and private investigators, hoping that fresh perspectives might reveal new avenues of inquiry. But as the years passed without significant developments, Marcus had been forced to acknowledge that the case might never be solved through conventional investigative methods. The trail had grown cold, witnesses had died or moved away, and physical evidence had been lost to time and weather. The missing students had become a permanent weight on his conscience, a reminder of the limitations of human knowledge and the persistence of mystery, even in an age of advanced forensic science. Marcus's reputation as an investigator had remained strong throughout his career, and he had successfully solved dozens of other cases that had brought closure to families and justice to communities. But the class of 1994 had remained his greatest failure, the case that had eluded his best efforts and left 25 families without answers. When he had retired from the Sheriff's Department in 2019, the unsolved disappearance had been the shadow that darkened what should have been a celebration of 30 years of distinguished service. The discovery of personal belongings in the basement of Millbrook High School represented more than just new evidence in a cold case. For Marcus, it was validation of his long-held belief that the official explanation for the students' disappearance had never been adequate. The fact that the evidence had been literally buried beneath the school suggested a level of premeditation and cover-up that went far beyond the accidental tragedy that investigators had accepted for 3 decades. Someone had known what had really happened to those students, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the truth would never be discovered. Standing in that underground chamber, Marcus felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven him throughout his career. The case that had haunted him for 31 years was finally yielding its secrets, and he was not going to allow bureaucratic caution or political considerations to prevent the truth from being revealed. The families of the missing students deserved answers, and the perpetrators of whatever crime had been committed deserved to face justice, regardless of how much time had passed or how carefully they had hidden their actions. The renovation and eventual demolition of Millbrook High School had been a contentious issue in Cedar Falls for over 5 years, dividing the community along generational and economic lines that reflected deeper tensions about the town's identity and future. The building, constructed in 1962 during the height of the baby boom, had served as the educational and cultural heart of the community for decades, hosting not only daily classes but also basketball games, theatrical productions, and graduation ceremonies that marked the passages of thousands of young lives. By 2018, however, the structure had become a financial burden that the cash-strapped school district could no longer ignore. The problems with Millbrook High School had been accumulating for years, like sediment in a riverbed, each issue seemingly minor on its own, but collectively creating an insurmountable challenge. The heating system, installed when natural gas was cheap and energy efficiency was an afterthought, had been breaking down regularly for the past decade, forcing students and teachers to endure classrooms that swung between stifling heat and bitter cold, depending on which sections of the antiquated boiler were functioning on any given day. The electrical system, designed for an era before computers and internet connections, had been patched and repatched so many times that fire inspectors had begun issuing increasingly stern warnings about safety violations. More visibly problematic was the building's deteriorating exterior, where decades of Pennsylvania winters had taken their toll on the brick facade and mortar joints. Water damage had become a constant concern, with maintenance crews placing buckets in hallways during every significant rainstorm and custodians growing weary of cleaning up the mold and mildew that seemed to appear in new locations each semester. The roof, originally designed to last 25 years, had been repeatedly patched and resealed for nearly 6 decades, creating a patchwork of materials and techniques that provided only temporary relief from the elements. The school board had commissioned 3 separate engineering studies between 2015 and 2018, each reaching the same conclusion. Renovation costs would exceed $12 million, while a complete rebuild on the same site would require an investment of $18 million. For a district already struggling with budget shortfalls and declining enrollment, these figures represented an impossible financial burden. Property tax revenues had been stagnant for years as young families moved to newer developments in neighboring counties, leaving behind an aging population on fixed incomes who were increasingly resistant to tax increases for any purpose. The decision to close Millbrook High School and consolidate operations with the newer Cedar Valley High School, located 15 miles away in the growing suburb of Millbrook Township, had been announced in March 2019 amid protests from alumni, parents, and community members who viewed the closure as another step in the gradual decline of their hometown. The consolidation meant that Cedar Falls students would face longer bus rides and reduced opportunities to participate in extracurricular activities, but school board members argued that the financial realities left them no alternative. Controversy had erupted again in 2021 when the school board announced its intention to sell the Millbrook High School property to a regional development company that planned to demolish the building and construct a shopping complex anchored by a chain pharmacy and fast food restaurants. Opposition groups led by the Cedar Falls Historical Society argued that the building represented an important piece of the community's architectural heritage and should be preserved as a community center or museum. Supporters of the demolition countered that the town needed the tax revenue that new commercial development would generate, and that maintaining the aging building would continue to drain resources that could be better used elsewhere. The environmental assessment required before demolition could begin had been scheduled to start in September 2024, but the process had been delayed by bureaucratic complications and the discovery of several issues that required additional study. Asbestos had been found in ceiling tiles and floor adhesives throughout the building, necessitating specialized removal procedures that would add both time and expense to the demolition timeline. Lead paint on interior walls and window frames required careful handling to prevent contamination of surrounding soil and groundwater. Janet Morrison, the site supervisor hired by Morrison Environmental Consulting to oversee the pre-demolition assessment, had approached the project with the methodical thoroughness that had made her company one of the most respected environmental remediation firms in the region. Her team had spent weeks cataloging hazardous materials, testing soil samples, and mapping the building's infrastructure to ensure that demolition could proceed safely and in compliance with all applicable regulations. The basement level had presented particular challenges, as decades of modifications and repairs had created a complex maze of pipes, electrical conduits, and structural elements that needed to be carefully documented before removal could begin. It was during this basement survey that Janet's team had first detected the anomalous readings that would ultimately lead to the discovery that would transform the investigation into the missing class of 1994. Ground-penetrating radar equipment used routinely to identify underground utilities and structural elements had detected a void beneath the basement floor that didn't correspond to any of the building's architectural plans. The cavity appeared to be artificial, with regular dimensions that suggested it had been deliberately excavated rather than formed by natural processes. Initially, Janet had assumed that the void represented some kind of forgotten storage area or utility vault that had been sealed over during one of the building's many renovations. Such discoveries were not uncommon in older buildings, where institutional memory often failed to preserve records of modifications made decades earlier. However, the size and location of the cavity had been puzzling, as it didn't align with the logical placement of utilities or storage areas that would have been typical for the building's original design. The decision to excavate and investigate the cavity had been made reluctantly, as it represented an unplanned expense and potential delay in the demolition schedule. Janet had hoped to find nothing more than empty space, or perhaps some discarded construction materials that could be easily removed and disposed of according to standard protocols. The discovery of personal belongings had transformed a routine environmental assessment into something far more serious and complicated. The items recovered from the cavity had been carefully photographed and catalogued by Janet's team before being turned over to Detective Ray Thompson and the County Sheriff's Department. The collection included clothing items that appeared to be from the 1990s, based on their style and condition, as well as jewelry, wallets, and identification cards that bore the names and photographs of students from Millbrook High Schools, class of 1994. Most disturbing were the graduation caps and gowns that had been found folded and stacked, as if they had been carefully stored rather than discarded. The preservation of these items after 3 decades underground had been remarkable, suggesting that the cavity had remained relatively dry and sealed from the elements. The concrete floor that had concealed the cavity showed signs of having been cut and then repoured, with subtle differences in color and texture that became apparent only under close examination. The professional quality of the concrete work suggested that whoever had created the cavity had possessed significant construction skills and access to the necessary tools and materials. Detective Thompson had immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery and had contacted Marcus Riley before proceeding with any further investigation. Thompson, who had been with the County Sheriff's Department for only 8 years, was familiar with the history of the missing class of 1994, but had never been directly involved in the investigation. He understood, however, that the case remained one of the most significant unsolved mysteries in the county's history, and that any new evidence would require careful handling to avoid compromising potential prosecutions. The involvement of Dr. Sarah Chen, the environmental consultant who had first detected the cavity, had added a scientific dimension to the investigation that had been lacking in the original inquiry 3 decades earlier. Chen's expertise in soil analysis and contamination detection had enabled the team to determine that the cavity had been excavated and sealed sometime in the mid-1990s based on the composition of the concrete and the stratification of soil layers around the excavation site. Her equipment had also detected trace amounts of organic compounds in the soil that suggested the presence of biological material, though further testing would be required to determine the nature and source of these substances. The location of the cavity within the school building had raised immediate questions about who would have had both the access and the knowledge necessary to create such an elaborate concealment. The basement level of Millbrook High School had been accessible only to maintenance staff and administrators with master keys, as it contained utility systems and storage areas that were not part of the normal educational facilities. The timing of the concealment, apparently occurring shortly after the student's disappearance in May 1994, suggested that the perpetrator had acted quickly to hide evidence of whatever crime had been committed. Marcus had spent his first night, after the discovery, reviewing his old case files, searching for any references to individuals who might have had the necessary access and opportunity to create the hidden cavity. The maintenance staff at Millbrook High School in 1994 had consisted of 3 full-time employees and several part-time workers who had been responsible for cleaning, repairs, and groundskeeping. The head custodian, Walter Brennan, had worked at the school for over 20 years and had been considered above suspicion during the original investigation due to his sterling reputation and the absence of any apparent motive. But Marcus now found himself reconsidering assumptions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but might have prevented investigators from pursuing certain lines of inquiry. Brennan had certainly possessed the keys and knowledge necessary to access the basement areas, and his position would have given him opportunities to work on concealment projects without attracting attention from other staff members. The custodial schedule would have provided him with periods of time when he was alone in the building, particularly during evening hours and weekends when the school was officially closed. The possibility that someone within the school system itself might have been responsible for the student's disappearance represented a fundamental shift in how the case needed to be approached. The original investigation had focused primarily on external threats, accidents, mechanical failures, or crimes committed by strangers who had encountered the students during their journey to Camp Wildwood. The idea that the perpetrator might have been someone the students knew and trusted had been considered but never thoroughly explored, partly because it seemed incompatible with the evidence suggesting that the students had left Cedar Falls and traveled toward the mountains. As Marcus stood in the basement chamber, looking down at the excavated cavity, he realized that everything he thought he knew about the case might need to be reconsidered. The students had never left Cedar Falls. They had never boarded a bus bound for Camp Wildwood. Whatever had happened to them had occurred here, in their own school, probably within hours of their last confirmed sightings on the afternoon of May 15th, 1994. The elaborate deception that had convinced investigators to search the Pine Ridge Mountains for evidence had been designed to conceal a crime that had been committed much closer to home. The implications of this realization extended far beyond the immediate question of what had happened to the missing students. If someone connected to the school had been responsible for their disappearance, then the subsequent investigation had been not just ineffective, but actively misdirected by false information provided by the perpetrator. The families of the victims had spent 31 years believing that their children had died in a tragic accident, when in reality they had been the victims of a carefully planned and executed crime. The morning of May 15th, 1994, had dawned, bright and clear in Cedar Falls, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed tailor-made for celebrations and new beginnings. At Millbrook High School, the graduating seniors moved through their final day, with a mixture of excitement and nostalgia that was palpable in every hallway and classroom. These 23 young people, who had grown up together in the small Pennsylvania town, were on the verge of scattering across the country to pursue their dreams, and their weekend retreat to Camp Wildwood was intended to be one last shared adventure before they went their separate ways. Jennifer Walsh, the class valedictorian, had arrived at school that morning carrying a carefully packed overnight bag and a journal where she'd been recording her thoughts about graduation and the future that lay ahead. At 17, Jennifer possessed the kind of quiet intelligence and natural leadership that had made her beloved by both her classmates and teachers. She had been accepted to Carnegie Mellon University with a full academic scholarship and planned to study computer engineering, a field that was just beginning to attract significant numbers of women. Her journal entry from that morning, later recovered by investigators from her bedroom, had captured the optimism that characterized not just Jennifer, but her entire graduating class. Tommy Rodriguez, the star quarterback who had led the Millbrook Eagles to their first state championship in 15 years, had spent the early morning hours at the gym, maintaining the training regimen that had earned him a football scholarship to Penn State University. Tommy's athletic achievements had made him something of a local celebrity, but those who knew him well understood that his real passion was for teaching and coaching. He had already declared his intention to major in education and return to Cedar Falls after college to become a high school coach, continuing the cycle of mentorship that had shaped his own development. Sarah Chen, whose parents had emigrated from Taiwan when she was 5 years old, had been one of only 3 Asian American students in her graduating class, but her warm personality and academic excellence had made her a natural bridge between different communities within the school. Sarah's acceptance to Johns Hopkins University to study pre-medicine had been a source of immense pride for her family, who had sacrificed tremendously to provide their daughter with educational opportunities that had been unavailable to them. She had spent the morning helping her younger brother prepare for his own final exams, while mentally reviewing the packing list for the weekend trip. The other members of the class of 1994 represented the full spectrum of small-town America in the early 1990s. There was Michael Barnes, whose family had run the local hardware store for 3 generations and who planned to study business administration at a state university before returning to take over the family business. Rebecca Martinez had overcome significant financial hardships to become the first person in her family to graduate from high school and had earned a partial scholarship to study nursing at a community college 2 hours away. David Wilson, whose father worked at the steel mill, had discovered a talent for mechanical engineering that had earned him admission to a technical institute where he hoped to design the kind of industrial equipment that kept small towns like Cedar Falls economically viable. The dynamics within this graduating class reflected the social complexities of their generation, caught between the lingering conservatism of their parents and the rapid cultural changes that were reshaping American society. These students had grown up during the end of the Cold War, witnessed the rise of personal computers and the early stages of the Internet revolution, and come of age during a period of relative economic prosperity that had made college educations seem both achievable and necessary for success in an increasingly competitive world. Their final day at Millbrook High School had been carefully orchestrated by the school administration to provide closure while building excitement for the weekend retreat that would serve as their unofficial graduation celebration. The morning had been devoted to completing final grade submissions and clearing out lockers, while the afternoon had been reserved for a rehearsal of the graduation ceremony that would take place the following week. Principal Eleanor Patterson, who had overseen the education of these students for 4 years, had worked closely with the class sponsors to ensure that every detail of their final weekend together would be memorable and meaningful. The choice of Camp Wildwood as the destination for the senior retreat had been made after extensive research and planning by the class advisory committee, which included both student representatives and faculty sponsors. The camp, located in the Pine Ridge Mountains, approximately 2 hours from Cedar Falls, offered the kind of rustic outdoor experience that was intended to foster bonding and reflection among the graduating seniors. The facility included comfortable, dormitory-style accommodations, a dining hall capable of serving large groups, and recreational facilities for hiking, swimming, and group activities. The itinerary for the weekend had been designed to balance structured activities with free time for informal socializing and personal reflection. Saturday morning was to begin with a group hike to a scenic overlook, where the students would participate in a visioning exercise designed to help them articulate their goals for the future. The afternoon would include team-building activities and recreational games, while the evening would feature a campfire ceremony where each student would share a favorite memory from their high school years and offer words of encouragement to their classmates. Sunday morning was reserved for a more serious ceremony where the students would create time capsules containing letters to their future selves and mementos from their high school years. These capsules were to be opened at their 10-year class reunion, providing a tangible connection between their teenage dreams and their adult realities. The weekend would conclude with a farewell brunch before the return journey to Cedar Falls, where the students would have just 1 week to prepare for their official graduation ceremony. The departure from Millbrook High School had been scheduled for 6:30 p.m. on Friday, May 15th, allowing students to complete their final day of classes and handle any last-minute preparations. The bus assigned to transport the group was a modern vehicle from the district's fleet, driven by Robert Kellerman, an experienced driver who had been transporting students safely for over 2 decades. Kellerman had made the journey to Camp Wildwood multiple times in previous years and was familiar with both the primary route and several alternate paths through the mountains. The 2 faculty chaperones accompanying the students were Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton, a beloved English teacher who had taught many of the seniors and had volunteered to supervise the trip despite her approaching retirement, and Mr. James Fletcher, a young social studies teacher who had joined the faculty only 2 years earlier, but had quickly established strong relationships with the students through his coaching of the debate team and his sponsorship of the Student Government Association. The final moments before departure had been captured in photographs taken by parents and younger students who had gathered in the school parking lot to see the seniors off on their adventure. These images, preserved in family photo albums and school yearbooks, showed young faces bright with excitement and anticipation, completely unaware that they were embarking on a journey from which they would never return. The students had boarded the bus amid a chorus of well wishes and promises to call home once they arrived safely at Camp Wildwood. According to the testimonies collected during the subsequent investigation, the bus had pulled away from Millbrook High School at exactly 6:35 p.m., 5 minutes behind schedule due to last-minute preparations and tearful farewells. Several witnesses had watched the vehicle disappear around the corner onto Main Street, heading toward the interstate highway that would take them into the mountains. The scene had seemed perfectly normal, with no indication of the tragedy that investigators would later conclude had befallen the group somewhere along their route to Camp Wildwood. But now, standing in the basement of that same school building, 31 years later, Marcus Riley understood that those witness accounts had been part of an elaborate deception. The bus had never left Cedar Falls. The students had never begun their journey to Camp Wildwood. Whatever had happened to them had occurred here, within the walls of their own school, probably within hours of the time they were supposed to have departed for their weekend retreat. The realization that the students had been murdered in their own school transformed Marcus's understanding of both the crime and the investigation that had followed. The perpetrator had not been a stranger who had encountered the students along a mountain road, but someone who had access to the school building and the ability to orchestrate an elaborate cover-up. The fake departure, the planted evidence in the Pine Ridge Mountains, and the false communications that had misdirected the search efforts had all been carefully planned elements of a deception that had succeeded for over 3 decades. The logistics of such a crime would have required extensive preparation and intimate knowledge of both the school building and the planned trip to Camp Wildwood. The perpetrator would have needed to subdue or otherwise incapacitate 23 healthy teenagers and 2 adult chaperones without alerting anyone in the surrounding community. They would have needed access to construction equipment and materials to create the hidden cavity where the students' belongings had been concealed. Most importantly, they would have needed the ability to maintain their deception for years, while investigators and family members desperately searched for answers. The social dynamics of small-town Cedar Falls had inadvertently aided the cover-up by creating an environment where certain individuals were considered above suspicion due to their positions or reputations within the community. The original investigation had focused primarily on external threats while giving minimal scrutiny to those who had been closest to the students and most familiar with their plans. The assumption that the crime had occurred somewhere else had prevented investigators from examining the school building itself as a potential crime scene. As Marcus contemplated the magnitude of the deception that had been perpetrated, he found himself grappling with questions that went beyond the immediate circumstances of the student's disappearance. How many people in Cedar Falls had known or suspected the truth but remained silent? Had there been signs or warnings that had been ignored or misinterpreted? Most troubling of all was the perpetrator still living among them, having spent 31 years watching the community grieve for victims whose fate they alone knew. The discovery in the school basement had opened a door that could never be closed again, unleashing questions and possibilities that would force the entire community to confront the reality that evil could hide behind the most trusted and familiar faces. The missing class of 1994 had finally begun to reveal its secrets, but Marcus suspected that the truth, when it was fully uncovered, would prove more disturbing than anyone had imagined possible. The weight of revelation settled on Marcus Riley's shoulders like a lead blanket as he stood in the excavated basement chamber, his mind racing through the implications of what they had discovered. The personal belongings of 23 students, carefully preserved beneath the very school where they had spent their final day, represented more than just evidence of a crime. They were proof of a betrayal so profound that it challenged everything Marcus thought he understood about human nature and the community he had devoted his life to protecting. The calm, methodical approach that had served him well throughout his law enforcement career now seemed insufficient to process the magnitude of what lay before him. Detective Thompson moved with careful precision as he documented the scene, his camera flash illuminating the cavity in stark bursts of light that cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. Each photograph captured another piece of the puzzle that would eventually reveal the full scope of the crime. But Marcus knew that the technical aspects of evidence collection were only the beginning of a much larger challenge. The discovery would require them to reconstruct not just the events of May 15th, 1994, but the entire web of deception that had kept the truth hidden for over 3 decades. Dr. Chen knelt beside the excavation with her soil analysis equipment, carefully extracting samples that would be subjected to forensic testing. Her scientific training had prepared her to remain objective in the face of disturbing discoveries, but even she seemed shaken by the organized nature of the concealment they had uncovered. The precision with which the cavity had been constructed and the careful arrangement of the personal belongings suggested a level of planning that transformed the crime from an act of passion or opportunity into something far more calculated and disturbing. "We need to expand the excavation," Dr. Chen said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the work lights. "The ground-penetrating radar is showing additional anomalies in the surrounding area. There may be more evidence that hasn't been uncovered yet." Marcus nodded, though part of him dreaded what additional discoveries might reveal. The cavity they had already exposed was approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, dimensions that had been precisely calculated for their intended purpose. If there were additional excavations nearby, it suggested that the crime had been even more extensive than the evidence already indicated. The thought of what might be hidden in the soil beneath their feet made Marcus's stomach churn with a mixture of anger and grief. The morning sun was beginning to filter through the basement windows, casting long rectangles of light across the concrete floor and highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air, disturbed by their activity. The contrast between the peaceful spring morning outside and the horror they were uncovering below ground seemed to emphasize the surreal nature of their discovery. Marcus found himself thinking about the families of the missing students, most of whom were probably beginning their daily routines, with no knowledge that their 31-year wait for answers was finally coming to an end. "I need to make some calls," Marcus said, pulling out his cell phone and stepping away from the excavation site. The basement's concrete walls interfered with the signal, forcing him to climb the stairs to ground level where he could get a clear connection. The first call would be to Sheriff Patricia Hendricks, who had been elected to succeed him 3 years earlier. Patricia had been one of his most trusted deputies, and he knew she would handle the situation with the professionalism and sensitivity that such a momentous discovery required. The second call would be much more difficult. Margaret Walsh, the mother of valedictorian Jennifer Walsh, had become the unofficial spokesperson for the families of the missing students. For 31 years, she had maintained a detailed timeline of the events surrounding the disappearance and had never stopped pressing for answers. Margaret deserved to hear about the discovery from someone she trusted before the media inevitably got hold of the story and turned it into a sensational headline. As Marcus dialed Margaret's number, he found himself struggling to find the right words to convey what they had found. How do you tell a mother that her daughter's personal belongings have been discovered buried beneath the school she attended, confirming that the accident she had been told to accept was actually a carefully orchestrated murder? How do you explain that the community she had trusted to protect her child had harbored a killer who had spent decades hiding in plain sight? Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the cautious hope that had characterized every conversation they had shared over the years. "Marcus, this is unexpected. Do you have news about Jennifer?" "Margaret, I need you to sit down," Marcus began, his voice steady, despite the emotional turmoil he was feeling. "We've made a discovery at the old high school. It's significant, and it's going to change everything we thought we knew about what happened to the class of 1994. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Margaret spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. Did you find them?" "We found their belongings, Margaret. Personal items that belonged to Jennifer and her classmates. They were buried in the basement of Millbrook High School. They never left Cedar Falls." The sound that came through the phone was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. A combination of grief, rage, and relief that seemed to encompass 31 years of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. Margaret Walsh had never given up hope that her daughter's fate would eventually be revealed, but the reality of confirmation was almost too overwhelming to process. "Who?" Margaret managed to ask through her tears. "Who did this to our children?" "We don't know yet," Marcus replied honestly. "But we're going to find out. I promise you that, Margaret. After all these years, we're finally going to get answers." The conversation with Sheriff Hendricks had been more straightforward, but equally charged with emotion. Patricia had immediately grasped the significance of the discovery and had begun mobilizing resources for what would undoubtedly become one of the largest criminal investigations in the county's history. The state police would need to be notified, forensic specialists would need to be brought in, and the media would need to be managed carefully to prevent the investigation from being compromised by premature disclosure of evidence. By the time Marcus returned to the basement, the excavation team had expanded their work area and had begun uncovering additional evidence. A section of the concrete floor approximately 20 feet from the original cavity showed signs of having been cut and re-poured, suggesting that the concealment operation had been even more extensive than initially apparent. The precision of the concrete work continued to suggest that the perpetrator had possessed significant construction skills and access to professional-grade equipment. Dr. Chen's soil analysis equipment had detected traces of lime in the surrounding earth, a substance commonly used to accelerate decomposition and mask odors. The presence of lime suggested that the perpetrator had been aware of forensic techniques for concealing evidence and had taken steps to prevent the discovery of the crime even if the burial site was eventually found. The level of sophistication demonstrated by these precautions indicated that they were dealing with someone who had either received training in evidence concealment or had researched the subject extensively. The expansion of the excavation revealed additional personal belongings that painted a more complete picture of what had happened to the missing students. Graduation caps and gowns were found folded and stacked with the kind of care that suggested reverence rather than disposal. Class rings, jewelry, and watches had been arranged in small groups, as if the perpetrator had wanted to preserve the dignity of the victims even while concealing evidence of their murder. The organized nature of the concealment suggested a complex psychological profile that combined meticulous planning with unexpected elements of respect for the victims. Detective Thompson had established a systematic approach to cataloging the evidence, creating detailed records of each item's location and condition before it was removed from the excavation site. The investigation would require extensive forensic analysis to determine not just what had happened to the students, but when and how the concealment had been accomplished. The concrete work alone would have required several hours of uninterrupted access to the basement area, suggesting that the perpetrator had either worked during a time when the school was closed or had possessed the authority to work without being questioned. The maintenance records for Millbrook High School during the relevant time period had been preserved in the district's archives, and Marcus knew that examining these documents would be crucial to identifying who had been authorized to perform construction work in the basement area. The head custodian in 1994 had been Walter Brennan, a man whom Marcus remembered as dedicated and trustworthy. But the evidence before them suggested that trust had been misplaced and that someone within the school system had used their position to commit an unspeakable crime. The psychological impact of the discovery was beginning to affect everyone involved in the excavation. The realization that they were uncovering evidence of mass murder committed by someone the victims had known and trusted created an atmosphere of tension and horror that was difficult to process. These had not been random victims killed by a stranger, but young people who had been betrayed by someone they had no reason to fear. The calculated nature of the cover-up suggested a level of cold-blooded planning that was almost impossible to comprehend. As the day progressed and more evidence was uncovered, Marcus found himself grappling with questions that went beyond the immediate circumstances of the crime. How had the perpetrator managed to overpower 23 healthy teenagers and 2 adults without anyone escaping or raising an alarm? What had motivated such a horrific act against young people who were on the verge of beginning their adult lives? Most troubling of all, how had someone capable of such evil managed to live undetected in the community for over 3 decades? The answers to these questions would require a complete reconstruction of the events of May 15th, 1994, and a thorough investigation of everyone who had been connected to the school and the planned trip to Camp Wildwood. The discovery in the basement had provided the first solid evidence of what had happened to the missing students, but it had also opened a door to a mystery that was far more complex and disturbing than anyone had previously imagined. The excavation of the basement cavity had uncovered more than just personal belongings. It had revealed the carefully constructed facade of a man who had spent 31 years living among the very people whose children he had murdered. As the investigation progressed through the following weeks, piece by piece, the truth about Walter Brennan began to emerge like a photograph developing in a darkroom, each detail more disturbing than the last. The mild-mannered custodian, who had been universally respected by students, teachers, and parents, had been living a double life of such calculated evil that it challenged everyone's faith in their ability to recognize danger hiding in plain sight. Walter Brennan had worked at Millbrook High School for 23 years by the time of the student's disappearance, arriving in Cedar Falls in 1971 as a young man seeking steady employment and a quiet place to build a life. His references from his previous job at a school district in Ohio had been impeccable, describing him as reliable, hardworking, and excellent with students. What those references had failed to mention, because it had never been discovered, was that 3 students from his former school had gone missing during his tenure there. Their disappearances attributed to runaways and family problems rather than any criminal activity. The pattern that investigators now began to uncover stretched back decades, revealing a predator who had perfected his methods through years of careful observation and planning. Brennan had specifically sought employment in schools, using his position as a custodian to gain access to student records, learn about their personal lives, and identify potential victims who would be less likely to be immediately missed. His friendly demeanor and reputation for helping students had provided him with the perfect cover for gathering information about their families, their relationships, and their plans for the future. The reconstruction of the events of May 15th, 1994, revealed a crime of stunning audacity and preparation. Brennan had spent months planning the elimination of the entire graduating class, recognizing that their departure for college would soon scatter them beyond his reach. The senior retreat to Camp Wildwood had provided him with the perfect opportunity, as it would give him several hours before anyone would expect to hear from the students. The fake departure from the school parking lot had been orchestrated with theatrical precision, using a decoy bus that he had arranged to be driven by an accomplice who had since died, taking his secrets to the grave. The real bus, carrying the unsuspecting students and their chaperones, had never left the school grounds. Instead, it had been driven into the maintenance garage beneath the building, where Brennan had been waiting with a carefully prepared plan to incapacitate his victims. The carbon monoxide poisoning had been swift and silent, accomplished by connecting the bus's exhaust system to the interior ventilation. The students had likely fallen unconscious within minutes, never knowing what was happening to them or who was responsible for their fate. The methodical disposal of the bodies had taken place over several days, with Brennan using his knowledge of the school's construction schedule to coordinate his activities with planned renovation work that would disguise the signs of his excavation. The basement cavity had been only one of several burial sites he had created, with additional remains, discovered in the school's foundation and beneath the parking lot. The limestone composition of the local soil had aided in the preservation of evidence, allowing forensic investigators to piece together the full scope of the crime. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of a killer who combined meticulous planning with a twisted sense of ceremony. The careful arrangement of the students' personal belongings, the preservation of their graduation caps and gowns, and the respectful positioning of their remains suggested someone who saw himself not as a murderer, but as a collector preserving precious artifacts. Brennan's apartment, searched after his arrest, contained hundreds of photographs of students from his various jobs, along with detailed journals documenting his observations of their lives and his fantasies about possessing them forever. The community's reaction to the revelations about Walter Brennan had been a mixture of horror, disbelief, and soul-searching that would reshape Cedar Falls for generations to come. Parents who had trusted him with their children struggled to reconcile their memories of the friendly custodian with the reality of what he had done. Former students who had received help and encouragement from Brennan found themselves questioning not just their judgment, but their understanding of human nature itself. The violation of trust ran so deep that many families left Cedar Falls entirely, unable to bear living in a place where such evil had hidden for so long. The arrest of Walter Brennan at his modest apartment on Maple Street had been anticlimactic after the magnitude of the crimes he had committed. At 74 years old, he appeared frail and harmless, his stooped shoulders and thinning hair making it difficult to imagine him as capable of overpowering 25 people. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, from his fingerprints on the concrete used to seal the burial sites to DNA evidence linking him to the victim's clothing. Faced with incontrovertible proof of his guilt, Brennan had confessed with the same methodical precision that had characterized his crimes. The trial of Walter Brennan became a national sensation, drawing media attention from across the country and putting Cedar Falls under an uncomfortable spotlight. The details that emerged during testimony revealed the full scope of his crimes, including evidence linking him to the disappearances of students from his previous jobs in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The final count of his victims totaled 47 young people over a career of killing that had spanned nearly 30 years. Margaret Walsh, who had waited 31 years for answers about her daughter Jennifer, found herself struggling with emotions that were more complex than she had anticipated. The confirmation that Jennifer had been murdered was devastating, but it also provided the closure that had eluded her for decades. Standing in the courtroom as Brennan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Margaret felt a mixture of grief, relief, and something approaching peace for the first time since her daughter's disappearance. The transformation of Cedar Falls in the aftermath of the revelations was profound and permanent. The town that had once prided itself on being a safe haven, where everyone knew their neighbors, was forced to confront the reality that evil could hide behind the most trusted faces. New safety protocols were implemented in schools throughout the region, and background checks for all school employees became far more rigorous and comprehensive. The memorial to the class of 1994 in the town square was expanded to include the names of all of Brennan's victims, creating a permanent reminder of the lives that had been lost to his predation. Marcus Riley, whose persistence and refusal to accept easy answers had ultimately led to the discovery of the truth, found himself reflecting on the nature of justice and the price of secrets. The case that had haunted him throughout his career had finally been solved, but the satisfaction he had expected to feel was tempered by the knowledge of how many lives had been destroyed by one man's evil. The families of the victims had finally received answers, but those answers had come at the cost of their faith in the fundamental goodness of their community. The demolition of Millbrook High School proceeded on schedule, but the building's destruction had taken on a different meaning in light of what had been discovered beneath its floors. The site was eventually transformed into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of Walter Brennan, with walking paths, benches, and a memorial wall listing the names of all 47 young people whose lives had been cut short. The park became a place of reflection and remembrance, where visitors could contemplate the importance of vigilance and the need to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. As the years passed, the story of the class of 1994 became a cautionary tale told in law enforcement training programs and criminology classes around the country. The case demonstrated the importance of questioning official narratives, following evidence wherever it leads, and never giving up on the search for truth, no matter how much time has passed. The persistence of Marcus Riley and the dedication of the investigators who finally uncovered the truth served as an inspiration to others working on cold cases and unsolved mysteries. The legacy of the missing class of 1994 lived on in the changes they had inspired and the lessons their tragedy had taught. Their deaths had not been in vain if they prevented other families from experiencing the same loss, and their memory continued to motivate those who worked to protect the innocent and seek justice for the forgotten. In the end, the truth had emerged from its decades-long burial, proving that no secret, no matter how carefully concealed, could remain hidden forever when good people refused to stop searching for answers. If this incredible true story of persistence, justice, and the power of never giving up has moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales of courage and determination. Your support helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories that remind us all of the importance of standing up for truth and never forgetting those who can no longer speak for themselves.